Our water connection acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land throughout Australia and their connection to country, sky, water, and community. We extend our respect to the traditional custodians of the place where you are listening. This episode is recorded in Kaurna country and Wurundjeri, Woi-wurrung, and Bunurong country. How can communities shape the future of water management? What if the key to solving our biggest water challenges is not just science, but people? Today, we're looking at water from a slightly different angle. We're looking at community empowering and community engagement and how can help us solve our problems. My name is Jez Borges. I'm on a mission to increase your water curiosity, and this is Our Water Connection. Welcome to today's episode. Today in the podcast, we're going to look into the role of communities in the future of water planning systems and how can we ensure communities can drive real transformation in water management. And to talk about this, I'm seated today with Professor Briony Rogers. Briony is a leader and systems entrepreneur focused on catalyzing innovative solutions and practices to support climate change adaptation and resilience. Based at the Monash University's Sustainable Development Institute, Briony is the CEO of Fire to Flourish and the director of the water part of this institute, where she brings together boundary-spanning experts in water, different things, water, sustainability, governance, and systems change. Her research focuses on strengthening policies, capabilities, and pathways for communities and practitioners to influence systems conditions for thriving futures. Welcome to Our Water Connection, Briony.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, that's very exciting to be here talking to you. So I normally start the episodes by asking very simple and basic questions. Why do you think it's important that we involve community in water management projects?
Well, if we think about the reason that we plan, manage, design our water systems, it's to deliver outcomes for community. And, whether that's really basic water servicing like water supply so that people have clean water to drink and to use in their households or to irrigate their gardens with, it's to keep people and communities safe from a public health perspective when we take waste away. It's to keep people safe and reduce nuisance when flooding happens. We think about all the different services that our water systems provide. It's all for community and for people and for the environments and the countries that we live on. And so if community is the ultimate beneficiary, then community have to be involved in the processes around setting values, aspirations, priorities, and plans for delivering those water services.
Yeah, that's very true. If there are the main outcome that we want to deliver to, they certainly should be embodied and involved in the process. And I was thinking that's very true, and there would be part of the community that is very active in that regard. But I was thinking, how can we get a more broader community attention? People have attention like divided in many things and they have their own lives and their own things that are paying attention. But how can we get their attention to the challenges that they might not be aware of in terms of water?
Yeah, and I think traditionally a lot of our water infrastructure is quite invisible and it's pits and pipes and pumps that are underground, and we haven't traditionally had that real connection when we think about our modern engineered water systems. But when we do notice it is when things go wrong, if there's disruptions to our water supply or a flood event or, a pollution outbreak. And so it's when things go wrong that people do realize and get really, really engaged in realize the importance of water and well-delivered services. And we saw that through the Millennium Drought that actually the kitchen table and barbecue conversations all through the 2000s, and particularly when we were really at the peak of that drought in 2005, 2006, 2007, everyone had opinions about water and what we can be doing to saving water and really proud of what they were doing in their own households to contribute to the drought response efforts. And so I don't think it's that far below the surface of people's understanding and awareness. It's just that we're not systematically engaging and involving communities in discussions around water. And we do tend to silo out different parts of the water system. So, there is the basic services of water supply and sewerage and drainage. But actually, one of the big experiences we had during the millennium drought was that our cities and our urban areas were brown. So the sports fields that people enjoy in their back gardens. And, we realize actually water's a really important enabler of all sorts of outcomes that we, look for and hope for from a livability perspective as well. So I think those sorts of conversations that really help build people's water literacy, but also an understanding of the importance of water in culture, identity, connection to place, and broader livability really helps to, I think, invite a deeper engagement between communities and professionals or organisations with formal responsibilities for providing those water services.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that you raised and an excellent example. I wasn't here during the Millennium Drought, but I've always heard that that was a very important time where people really switch on around water in the water community. And we have seen it a little bit here in South Australia in the last few months. It's been so dry. People in the Adelaide Hills are not connected to the main water system. Like you see how they're struggling, and it's in those moments that you can see that the community is like, huh, there's this thing that is called water. And like for us working in the industry, is like, yeah, we're here all the time doing it for you. So it's good to get that. I mean, it's not ideal in some circumstances to be talking about that during the Millennium Drought, but it certainly brings it to the front of mind of people for that. So it's excellent example. Yes.
And I think the other thing that brings up is that when we look at how our water systems have evolved over the last 100 years, when the objectives of our water system was really just about those basic engineering outcomes around water supply and sewerage and basic drainage, then that could largely be in the domain of the engineers and the planners that had formal professional roles and responsibilities. And it really was only technological questions or problems that needed to be solved. But as soon as we start thinking about water in the landscape, the environmental health, livability aspirations, communities having shared responsibilities around flood risk management, for example, then we start to see that it can't just be the engineers. Engineers still have a really critical role to play in those water systems, but it also needs to involve landscape designers and architects, urban development, households, community groups, ecologists, really diverse professions, disciplines, and stakeholders that need to be involved in considerations of our water systems, and community voice and engagement in those sorts of discussions is really important.
Yeah, for sure. I think yeah, you point out really well that it's a collection of different disciplines, and one of those kind of stakeholders is the community. I was going to ask you, like, how does your research or the research that you have done, maybe even in other areas, not only in water, can help us understand that relationship? We know there's a relationship between community and water, but how can we make it very crucial in that decision making and in that planning for more sustainable cities?
Yeah, so there's a few different things that I've done through my research during the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities. Part of the work I led was getting different stakeholders together into participatory processes to do envisioning work. So what is our vision of the future of water? How does that contrast with where things are at today? And what are the pathways of change that we need to be really proactively working towards on that journey? And a couple of those processes, we did involve community members in those sorts of discussions, both with their own in their own dedicated groups for community, but also bringing community and professionals, local government, some consultants, the water utility, etc., together to explore those different perspectives. And what that revealed is that when communities are supported and to have the conversations that are needed and, provided with information, ideals, examples of what's happened elsewhere, perhaps, as inspiration, but also truly valuing the local knowledge and the lived experience of community, of their place, that's a really fertile ground for coming up with innovative solutions and solutions that not only technically are going to function in the way that's needed, but also is really responsive to local place and local values. And so what we learned through that research is that not everyone in the community, but large parts of the community are up for those sorts of conversations, and that, community can be real champions and create an authorizing environment for perhaps doing things differently. If community members are brought along a journey of really understanding reality, here are the climate forecasts, here are the projections around what that might mean for our water resources, of our, flooding events and so on, then actually grappling with that and being empowered to be genuine part of the solution is really meaningful and something that communities are really up for. We're also
Yeah.
seeing that in the program I'm leading at the moment called Fire to Flourish. And Fire to Flourish is really about community-led disaster resilience. It's looking at how can communities be really enabled and supported as agents of change in their own areas, and resourced and supported to come together to do the resilience building work in that local place-based way, as a complement to the work that might be being done by local government,
But governments,
emergency service providers and so on. And again, what we're hearing and seeing through this research is that communities really take very seriously their role and responsibility in being part of a climate resilient future, and are really looking for ways to take action, whether that's at their household level or whether it's at a more community collective level. And I think the big challenge that comes up time and time again is often that our institutions aren't equipped to engage, or not experienced yet, to engage in true partnership with community. Often communities are positioned as in the disaster space as a poor, vulnerable victim of a disaster,
Yeah. Like
or
the
a passive
recipient of everything.
recipient.
Yeah.
Yeah, a
Mhm.
passive recipient of services, whatever sort of services, rather than what we hear from communities. We're active agents of change for ourselves and for our community, and we want to be part of the solution, and we do have shared responsibilities, but at the moment it's really hard to navigate. We're not resourced directly to be able to contribute in those ways, and the ways you're asking us to engage actually don't always work for us. So that starts to point to some of the areas where perhaps there's some innovation that's possible around methods and tools and approaches for connecting with communities in a more equal power sharing way.
Yeah. No, it's an excellent example. And I will come back to this Fire to Flourish. And then how could maybe learn some of these things for water type disasters that we have as well. You were talking before about that shared vision, how important it was to create that initial vision,
Mhm.
right? I was wondering like what happens when different parts, and these might be in those options or in those circumstances where you have community and other stakeholders or multiple parts of the community, when they don't
Mm,
have the same vision. Like how do we get to like a shared thing? If you can maybe
mm.
elaborate on that.
Yeah. Honestly, I've run many of these sorts of processes, and it's very rare that there's not alignment around the sort of outcomes that different stakeholders are looking for. There might be completely different ideas on the solutions or pathways for how to get there, but from an outcomes perspective, I'm yet to have a highly conflicted set of conversations around where are we really trying to achieve. And I think that's really key. How you set up a group of stakeholders to go through a participatory process, you got to find common ground as soon as you can, so that we've got that as an anchor point, because it's really important to hear different perspectives, to understand where there's points of contention or even conflict. And often those hotspots are actually really fruitful areas to dig into, where all sorts of possibilities might emerge. I haven't got a shared understanding of really what are we trying to achieve here from an outcomes perspective. It does make it difficult, and the relationships probably aren't going to have cemented enough to then be able to really constructively work through some of the parts where there might be not be such alignment. And so when we structure our visioning processes, often it is starting at that outcomes level, so that we can
Outcome.
say,
Yeah.
yeah, actually, we are all on the same page. We understand the context, we understand the challenges. And with all of that, we want to make sure that we've got clean water for everyone, that we've got healthy environments, that, when you've got a day of extreme heat, that, we're going to be well protected from a cooling perspective. Our public health is being looked after. And different people might express that in different ways. And that's also really important, that people's own voice and interpretation of those outcomes can be heard and really tailored. And that when we, in our visioning work, our transition planning work through the CRC for water sensitive cities, we did that in 7 different cities and regional towns and even suburbs around Australia. And, each one had really beautifully articulated vision statements that were tailored for their particular place, and all the contextual nuance really came through. But there were some really clear themes that were absolutely consistent across all those different places that I think create a good anchor point for where we needed to be heading, or where we do need to be heading from a water transition perspective.
Yeah, that's a very good angle and a very good way to see it, that even if people might have different paths or many different visions on how to get there, finding that common ground at the beginning, which it's most of the times already there in terms of water, because we all know kind of fundamentally what outcomes we want to get from that, is a good way to maybe use that as an argument later on when there's a bit of conflict. Is like, well, let us remember we're all here for the same reason. We're aiming for the same thing, and then that'll be a good anchor as well, as you say, to kind of continue building that transformation. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned also earlier, like some of the challenges was that some companies and some institutions are not quite set up in a way to have this community interaction all the time. So I did have a question here, like what are those common challenges that we may face when we're trying to integrate community in urban water planning? Is there anything else that comes to mind apart from that you already mentioned?
Yeah, I think there's a few. And, I think part of it is our understanding of risk. And what I mean
Yeah.
by that is that the water sector, for really good reasons, is pretty risk averse, because it's got, the population of entire cities, is dependent on a really, really carefully managed and well-regulated water system to make sure people don't get sick and so on. And so with that is a really deep sense of responsibility and risk aversion for trying things that might compromise, those sorts of public health outcomes, for example. And I think through the 20th century, the kind of implicit agreement between water servicing organisations and communities is those institutions will look after you and your public health and your water needs, and you as the customer will pay your bills and will deliver our services accordingly. And so it's quite a shift in relationship that is needed if communities are to have more power and more influence in decision making around water systems and water management. And so navigating that, understanding, well, actually what should be the role and the different spheres of influence for community members as compared to highly trained professionals whose formal responsibilities are to deliver water services. So
To deliver
there's
the
that kind of
service.
cultural element, I think, is part of it. And there's not an easy answer there, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to be had. Well, actually, what does it mean, and whose responsibility, where do different responsibilities lie? I think part of it is what we understand as the capabilities that need to exist both within communities and within institutions and professions with those formal responsibilities. So from a community perspective, water literacy, capability to make sense of data or, engage in conversations around water planning. So there's a capability side for communities, but there's also a capability side for professionals, and recognizing that actually it's a real skilled role to be able to engage and facilitate different sorts of conversations with community and meaningfully bring communities along a journey of co-production of knowledge for a particular place. And so a lot of so I think that's another part, the capabilities. I think another part is probably just the embedded assumptions and processes that we have around what happens when, what sort of conversations need to happen when. And so if communities are understood as an end of pipe, so to speak, stakeholder,
Yeah.
pay your fees and you'll get the service, then planning to have those conversations with community, and also the time that might be needed to have those conversations with community wouldn't necessarily be built into project plans or,
Yes.
ways of working. And so a lot of just our routines and frameworks for delivering projects very rarely factor in genuine community
Factor in that.
time
Yeah.
and community co-design time. I think co-design is a really important principle and practice that, wherever we can, how can community have input into shaping things that ultimately have implication for their place, their community. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, if we don't really take this communication with community seriously, it just becomes like another tick box that we need to do. And like, oh, yep, we told them about it. They'll be fine because they're the recipients of that. So I think it comes back to that empowering the communities to not be only the recipients of those services, but really be part of the planning for the future. So, yeah.
And I think a lot of the time community engagement is, understood as giving the community information to make them want the thing that we've got to offer. It's get them to want the widget that we've got. It's very crude, rather than, well, actually, what problem are we trying to solve? What outcomes are we trying to deliver?
Mm-hmm.
What are the options available? Do the community have really strong values or preferences that influence that? Do they have ideas around how to shape this in a way that works for them, that not only delivers water benefits, but maybe there's other co-benefits that can be delivered, when that broader set of community values is the reference point for design. And so, creating space for those really deep co-design sorts of discussions, I think not only gets better outcomes for community, but also really helps to increase community understanding and buy-in, and particularly if new things need to be tried. So, water sensitive urban design or integrated water management or, innovative solutions on the ground that might look different or might require something different of community. If they're on the journey for it, then they're much more likely to have the buy-in and the endorsement and not create issues down the track than if it's just imposed.
Yeah, for sure. And connected to that, I think it's all about the not only engagement and collaboration, but like that co-designing with the community, which is a big message there. How do we know if we're in the process of like doing a water management project? How do we know that we're really successfully engaging the community?
I think ask them. I think often there's a reluctance to actually ask the community, and partly because there is that probably cultural and historical hydrosocial contract is the technical term, but implicit agreement between customers or citizens and the institutions or the service providers that, it's not going to be complicated and it's not going to be hard. You pay for your service and we'll deliver it. And so, if there's potentially difficult conversations or a potential for, blame for something or potential for something to go wrong, or maybe something has gone wrong and feedback is needed, there's an understandable reluctance, or there can be an understandable reluctance to just have an open conversation and say, actually, what's important here. And I think we're doing better. I'm not saying that we're not doing any of this, across the sector. I think we are heading in good directions, but I think we've got to be really intentional about genuine space for meaningful conversation with community, even if the initial, phase of that conversation is difficult or has things we don't want to hear. I think there's also an understandable caution around raising community expectations in a way that actually can't be met, either from a technical perspective or a budget perspective or a risk management perspective. So, being really clear around boundaries, limitations, that sort of thing, so that it's not an idealistic way of engaging with community or anything's possible.
Yeah.
There's
make everything happen. We'll solve all of the problems. No, it's like this is the bound of what we're going to be working on, and this is kind of what we are looking to achieve maybe in this stage, if it is like a stage project or things like that. Yeah.
I think the other thing that is important to consider, I don't know if this is a barrier or a challenge, but it's a reality that I think needs to engage with, is that community is not homogenous. So even within one geographic footprint, there's many different communities, And so that's probably another element that, if we open up the conversation, there's going to be 100 different perspectives and voices, and how on earth are we going to engage with everyone or respond to everyone's needs? And so that beautiful messiness of community is actually what creates the vibrancy of community and that social fabric. And it is the reality of community. And so, I think being attuned to that diversity, but not being afraid of it, and just making sure that there are processes that allow for that inclusion, and really embrace that as a positive strength, actually, of what community
Yeah.
bring, rather than something that adds more complexity in a negative sense. And I think with that is also recognizing the distinct and sort of traditional owners and traditional custodians in engagement as distinct from generic community sort of engagement,
Community,
and really making sure that First Nations people in a particular location, whether traditional owners, cultural knowledge holders and so on, really have elevated and prioritised and sovereign right
for sure.
to lead conversations for their community in really self-determined ways.
Yeah, I think it's in a way it's just leaning into those challenges and take them as opportunities. Like just as when we say like, oh, we might just engage community for a box ticking thing. Like, no, really leaning, build that relationship, and also within that, not only do it with a certain cohort of the community, expand it to all the diversity that is there, and also for sure the Indigenous First Nations and custodians of the land where you're doing your project, or the area that will be serviced by that project. So Briony, you mentioned like that of course some of these things are already done. I was wondering like how do you envision that evolution of this community role in water management projects, especially in the future, especially with increasing challenge in climate change and urbanization, and things are really front of mind for people now and in the future?
Yeah. So I think, when we look at those, key drivers of urbanization and climate change, the sorts of impacts they could have on our livability if we're not really proactively managing our responses are pretty significant. The dystopian view or vision of, dense concrete jungles, highly disrupted water services, really bleak, not alive landscapes, regular flooding impacts. It's pretty bleak, and yet, and there are some really clear, I think, design principles. A lot of what the Water Sensitive Cities CRC was developing were principles and solutions and tools to mitigate those sorts of impacts, and instead create urban environments that are really healthy and green and cool and resilient. And a lot of those solutions, nature-based solutions and green infrastructure and really integrated urban planning and urban design practices that are responsive to local context are really key. And we're starting to see that around Australia. There's amazing projects and initiatives adopting those water-sensitive and integrated water management approaches. I think the social and governance innovation that's needed for communities to be systematically part of the development of those solutions and the stewardship of those solutions as well, in terms of from a management perspective, is probably, a bit of a frontier that we still need to engage with. And so I guess from a vision perspective, I would love to see that communities are recognised as equal partners in creating their places, and, the sorts of things that can be done at a household scale, at a precinct scale, from a community asset perspective, as well as that community willingness and endorsement of solutions that might not look business as usual or traditional, but are really needed to be able to mitigate some of those impacts, I think is really key. And so there's a real mindset shift around, I think, around community as equal partners in a systematic way, not in a niche way. And what that requires, I think, is different models of investment that really create space and time for the relationships to be developed, for those sorts of processes, whether participatory visioning, co-design, placemaking sort of processes. And from a resilience perspective, I think also being able to invest in solutions that might have a higher upfront cost, but the cost savings that happen over time because they can withstand those climate change impacts are really key as well.
It's going to be
We've got
key.
a new project at the moment at MSDI called Flood to Flourish. So it's really bringing together our water experience and our fire to flourish experience to
Yeah.
really look at what could it look like for communities to be engaged as equal collaborators in flood risk management and flood resilience solutions? So we're working with a few different, an inner urban area, large regional centre area, and a small rural cluster of villages in New South Wales and Victoria. And, the aim of the project is to develop new methods and tools that support communities to come alongside the institutions that have formal responsibilities around flood risk management in those equal conversations, so that we can explore in really quite sophisticated ways together with community and those formal stakeholders, actually, what is our vision for this place? What's our tolerance to flooding? Maybe a community is actually quite okay with a certain frequency or severity of flooding if they're able to respond in maybe more behavioural ways rather than infrastructural ways. So, for example, hypothetical, one solution might be to build a flood wall, but if that was to happen, all the values, cultural values, aesthetic values, environmental values will be compromised. And so the community might be willing to say, actually, we're willing to cope and accept an annual flood event of this amount and not build that wall because we're going to respond and take responsibility for impacts in a different way because it's more important to us that we have access to the river or whatever it is. So, they're deep conversations and they require everyone to share an understanding of flood risk. They require everyone to understand community values and vision for place, and they require a commitment to ongoing collaboration and responsibility that is shared. So it's a completely different relationship that needs to be established. So that'll be a really interesting project to explore. Like, we don't have those methods and tools at the moment. We've got technocratic methods and tools that are really important to do the technical analysis of flood risk and economic impact and so on. But at the moment, we're not systematically integrating those community values, perspectives, and lived experience and local knowledge as an overlay.
Yeah, that was exactly going to be my last question, because when you were talking about the fire to flourish earlier, I'm thinking in my background, like, can we do that for like flood to flourish? Even the name came in my mind, and that was going to be my question. But because we were kind of on another side, I was like, I'll come back to that later. And it was exactly going to be my next question. So it's so good to see that, yeah, the whole lot of knowledge and techniques and strategies that you have developed around fire, which is something that is quite important in Australian territories, now can be also applied for floods and like anything, like things that are related to water, like could be a drought, as I mentioned before, for South Australia. And I think it's a beautiful vision of really having community as an equal partner and an equal entity that is there as part of those planning exercises. So thanks for sharing that in advance of me asking the question.
But I think the reality is that communities, most people are aware of climate change and understand that the impacts are going to be really challenging. And certainly in our fire to flourish communities, there's the communities we're working with were all severely affected by the 2019-20 bushfires. And so they've got this lived experience of a horrific disaster that's, continues to take all sorts of toll on the community even 5 years later. And so there is an anxiety that exists in communities around, well, this is going to happen again. That was not a once-off. We know that this is we're in the climate frontiers here. And so we've got to be proactive about doing things. Some of the work we've done in those partner communities is measuring climate resilience at a hyper-local scale with communities. So community being involved in the data collection and the analysis across a whole lot of indicators of resilience, both from a generic perspective and a hazard-specific perspective, so fire or flood or heat. And one of the key findings out of that work has been that there's actually quite low levels of trust between community and institutions. And I think, that those questions weren't asked about the water sector specifically, but I think it does. I think it's something important to listen to. So if those levels of trust isn't there, how do we start to build trust? How do we start to
Building that
establish
relationship. Yeah.
relationships?
Yeah.
Exactly. And for there to be visibility, because the water sector is really taking seriously climate change in many different ways, but that might not be visible to the communities that haven't been involved in those conversations. So what can we be doing to create more transparency, to have more sophisticated conversations that really invite people in general to a broader consideration of what are we going to do about, the climate change
Yeah, for
futures
sure.
that are already on our doorstep.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities, I think, for the future. This episode is proudly supported by the Chris Davis AM Fellowship, an initiative of the Australian Water Association. His legacy lives on through this fellowship, empowering efforts to keep his passion for innovation and community impact alive. We're honored to have the support of this fellowship this season too, as we continue to share stories that connect us all to water. Now, back to the episode. Briony, how would you explain your work if you have a friend that knows nothing about the water and even the fire, like all the stuff that you do? How would you explain your work to a mate that doesn't know anything about it?
I'm an optimist and I'm a systems thinker. And so when I look at the challenges that are facing us, that can feel really scary and overwhelming, but change is happening whether or not we like it or do anything about it. And my research, my work is about helping people be really optimistic and hopeful and proactive about creating the change that we want, and to be on a pathway to a vision of a future that's really inspiring and exciting, and the world that we want to be able to live in. And that's complex. It involves many different people and perspectives. And so I'm really, determined to contribute by helping people have different sorts of conversations that make sense of where we find ourselves now, where we want to be in the future, and being really proactive and strategic and intentional about accelerating a change to our hopeful vision.
Lovely. Yeah, you have a really good description. That's great. What would be your message to young water professionals who might be listening to you right now?
I think my message would be that water is an incredibly powerful lens to look at the sorts of issues that we've been talking about. It's, out of everything, it's the most holistic lens that I can think of that really brings together technology and engineering and environment and people, spirituality, connection to place, connection to each other. It's such a powerful lens. And as a water professional, you've got huge opportunity to really shape cities. And I think often water as a sector can be kind of boiled down to a very instrumental water servicing sort of a role. Of course, that's part of it, but actually water is a city shaping opportunity. And so, through any of the work that you're doing, whatever your capacity or role is, how can you bring that city shaping or place shaping lens to really think transformatively about, well, what do we want for 50, 100 years in the future, and how can this thing I'm working on now help create that future vision?
That's beautiful. Yeah. And just to wrap up, Briony, why do you work in the water sector? I know you work in other things, but why do you work in the water sector?
I think it's got an incredible group of people, really diverse, interests, and there's so much passion. I think everyone I meet in the water sector, there's such passion, and I think, huge opportunity for innovation and diversity of roles as well. And I think the sorts of things that I have been talking about and that I think we're all collectively thinking about, really existential stuff in some ways, how are we going to be resilient into the future? How do we sustain our ways of life? When we've got resource depletion and overwhelm and climate change and so on. So some of that can be just too big, but if we can look at it through a lens like water, we can really get some powerful solutions that not only are important from a water perspective, but I also think signal how we can start to address some of those challenges in broader sectors and society as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Briony, thank you very much for your time today. I think this conversation was wonderful for us in the water professional sector to see different ways in which we can engage community, dream a little bit about how we can do it in the future, and think about how can we learn from projects as amazing as the Fire to Flourish and now seeing it applied in the water sector. So thank you very much for coming and talking to us today.
Thanks so much, Jess.
And thank you, everyone, for listening and being part of our community. Remember that your voice matters to us. By clicking on the send us a message link in the description, you can tell us one thing that you learned today from the conversation with Briony. Or if you got any feedback or ideas of new topics, you can also send those my way. Please share this episode with everyone, with community, with people around in your families, and see what we want to do with community in these water projects. We would love to hear your thoughts and hear the opinions of them as well. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and social media for any updates, highlights, and more ways to connect. Keep your curiosity flowing, and I'll see you next time.